So basically, we will be covering today the basic definition of oral history with reference to one example. Okay, so at a definition level, oral history is the study of subjective constructions of the self and other through spoken narratives. Okay, so the most important word in this definition is spoken narratives. That is the foundation of oral history method. However, the expression subjective construction of the self and others, that is important. Now, as we listen to spoken narratives by various individuals, what they speak in their narrative is, of course, very, very important. But equally important is the involvement of the speaker, kind of emotional involvement of the speaker in whatever she or he says. Now, we might listen to a few reports by, say, a news anchor about a particular event or happening or accident or incident. That report on a news or a news about any particular event does not result in the expression of any subjective construction. Why? Because the reporter who reports an event tries to be objective in portraying whatever she or he is describing. So in a matter-of-fact tone, a reporter will just describe what went on in any particular event or accident or incident. Therefore, whatever a reporter says does not constitute oral history. By definition, that is not oral history. Oral history, on the other hand, is a narration or is a narrative by an individual who has experienced a particular event or incident or accident or particular circumstances. So you might notice the way the definition has been put, there is a very close connection between a spoken narrative and the construction of subjectivity. Right? Now, in other words, the spoken narrative constitutes subjectivity. Let me rephrase myself. The subjective self of any individual, comes into being only when that subjective self is put into a story. If a particular subject remains silent about what experiences that subject had, then that subject does not come into being at all. That subject is just an individual, right? So an individual becomes a subject, or an individual becomes a self, as we put it, only when the subject is able to tell her or his own story in her or his own words. And that kind of story that a subject is able to tell, which brings into being her or his self, that kind of story is called oral history of that particular subject. So there could be women workers, there could be exploited labor, or uh, victim of, various kind of tortures, oppression, harassment, or there could be minorities whose rights are violated or who are subjected to discrimination. So all these kind of people who suffer oppression in any particular society, they are legitimate subjects for the study of oral history. So one can use the method of oral history in order to collect the narratives of those people who experience oppression, discrimination, neglect, but whose stories are not available in mainstream media or in mainstream books, right? So oral history is that kind of method which kind of reaches out to people in order to listen to their experiences and then in order to describe their narratives in their words. Any question about the definition? Now, there is a close connection between oral history and recovery of history. So the individuals who tell their story and who bring their subjectivity into being, by virtue of doing so, in fact, they create history or they recover history. Now, those are the kind of individuals, as I gave you examples, minorities in a society who are often neglected, who are often marginalized. If those individuals do not tell their story of what happened to them, that would mean the overall historical narrative or overall history that is available to us about that part of the world, that history very clearly misses the history of those individuals, because those individuals might not be highly educated, they might be afraid, they might not have an appropriate language, they might not have access to media and other institutions, or they might be simply oppressed by the powerful people in the society. Therefore, their stories are never told. And when their stories are never told, history remains quiet about them. And the overall knowledge of history which is being produced out of that society clearly misses any historical narrative about such people. Now, therefore, we say that oral history as a research method aims to recover history. It aims to recover the history which otherwise will get lost. So this is not a very old practice of looking at oral history as a process of recovering history. It began in 1960s, mainly in the United States and in UK. That was the time when the neglect of the ordinary person was challenged. What does that mean? The neglect of the ordinary person. So the historians who were on very esteemed positions in various universities, they definitely had access to very rich archive. And they, as many of you pointed in the last class, that you were aware of the connection between archives and history, right? So keeping that association in mind between archive and history, I'm trying to make this point today that before 1960s, the historians privileged archival research and they accessed archive in order to create history about any group of people or about wars. When we say about wars, by that we mean about extraordinary events. And when we say about various people, by that we mean the people of note, right? Extraordinary people. So you will read history, for example, about Napoleon, right? About Hitler, right? The noble people or the people of wide range influence, big political figures, Gandhi, Nehru, right? Jinnah. So that was an established practice that only the mega events and the mega personalities could have their histories. And history was supposed to emerge from their actions, right? But the 1960s marked a turn in this tendency in historical approach. And the turn was this, that we should also take into account the history of the common man. So 1960s, in 1960s, there was a challenge to the neglect of the ordinary person in the expression of history about any particular geographical area. Now, two major intellectuals of that time, of 1960s, were Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams being especially very important for literary studies. So what they did was they reevaluated the role of masses and they studied them as sources and subject of literatures. And what they noticed was that the bigger events that take place, they are actually product of apparently ordinary people. Therefore, the working class was important. Similarly, the participants in labor movement, they were important. Members of the minority cultures were important. Of course, it was much more challenging to reach out the huge masses in order to listen to their stories and record their stories. It was very challenging. But intellectuals like Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart argued that the true history of mankind is possible only if we are able to take into account what the masses feel, the common man feels. That was also the time when Paul Thompson wrote The Voice of the Past. This was a very influential book. So published in 78, reprinted in 88, again reprinted in 2000. The book had the same argument and introduced some methodologies to reach out to the masses, to record the history as it unfolds among the common man. So the kind of radical intention of this method, which was called the oral history method, its intention was to give a voice to the voiceless. So summing it up, there is a close association between oral history as a research method and recovery of history. So there is an example of how oral history works and how it is more privileged than other research methods. That is, a kind of case study interview uh, that we come across in this chapter by Samadli, the chapter that I shared with you. So basically, in that case study, the researchers study the Home Guard. The Home Guard was an organization in the Second World War England. And their role was to protect the local society, local kind of communities from any external invasion. Now, the Home Guard basically constituted men, and it kept women outside it. They did not include women for the active participation in the protection against different attacks. Now, the archival research shows that even if women were not included in the Home Guard, women grouped together to create their own group of Home Guard, and they called it Women's Home Defense League. There are varying numbers. Some say that there were about 14,000 women in Women's Home Defense League. This was a kind of women's counterpart to the Home Guard. So this Home Defense League had a big number of women, and they were trained to fight as well. They were trained to use weapons too. Some of the archival research tells us about that. Now, this Home Defense League was not recognized by the government in UK for a very long time. However, in 1943, there was an agreement between the government and Women's Home Defense League, after which this league was recognized. However, it was not allowed to train women in using weapons. Now, we get the documentation of this kind from the archives of the Home Guard. So when the researchers, about 10 years ago, when they studied the archives of the Home Guard, the archives are the documents which are available from 1940s onwards in the record of the Home Guard. Those documents tell what happened to Women's Home Defense League and what kind of agreement was reached. Now, the researchers noticed that there was a deliberate effort by the officials of the Home Guard to either destroy the record about Women's Home Defense League or not to include any record about them, about the Women's League in their main record. That is just one illustration of how much power archives carry. So basically, if you remove the record about Women's Home Defense League from the main office of the Home Guard, what you are doing is you are essentially removing the Women's Home Defense League from historical record, from historical narrative, so that nobody would know about that. So the archival research about Women's Home Defense League informed the researchers that there was very little information available about about the Home Defense League. And the information that was available was too factual, too matter of fact, and it was too limited at the same time. And therefore, it was not much reliable, right? So you might notice how even if uh, what seems to be very objective thing, which is the record in offices, in their registers, in their documentation, in their letters, official memos, what is supposed to be very objective and true, in fact, could be otherwise. Okay, so when, for example, a group of officials decide to destroy the history of any particular individuals or any particular groups, they can do that so easily because they are the ones who maintain the record. So if an archivist or archival researcher undertakes archival research on the Home Guard, obviously that researcher will not be able to find much about Women's Home Defense League. Now, how do the researcher then come to know about the significant role that Home Defense League played in the Home Guard? So for many, many years, people were not aware of the role that Home Defense League played. So very recently, the method of oral history was used in order to acknowledge, or let me put it the other way, in order to recover the history of women in Home Defense League. Of course, that history was hidden history. And we know for obvious reasons why it was hidden. It was hidden deliberately, right? So we are talking about the women of 40s and 50s in England. Obviously, the time where women's role was not fully acknowledged in society. A time of very strong patriarchy, right? And a kind of, a structured, attitude of inferiority towards women, kind of, uh, biased attitude towards women. We are talking about, 40s and 50s. So the history of women was kept hidden by the record. So here comes oral history to rescue the women and to kind of recover their history that they created through the Home Defense League. Okay, now to kind of, take it a little more deeper. So there is another comparison, between oral history as a research method and the survey research method. Now, we need to understand that comparison. Why? Because survey research methods, basically, they come from social sciences, like sociology, and to some extent history as well. Now, in survey research methods, okay, excuse me. So in survey research methods, uh, there is a lot of focus on structured responses. So for example, a researcher creates a questionnaire with fixed responses and shares those questions with well-chosen individuals and asks them to provide responses to the questions in that particular survey. Now, the researcher has to apply a frame in order to select the individuals who can participate in that particular survey. So this frame is called basically sampling frame. So for example, the individuals uh, who need to be studied, or the group that needs to be studied, might comprise of thousands of people. Say, for example, we are studying the Christian minority in Pakistan, okay, and we are studying about the, say, violation of their rights, okay. For this kind of project, it's not, well, we might have uh, a survey with us that we have prepared in the form of a questionnaire, but it will not be possible to reach out all the members of Christian community in the whole country. So what we do is we deliberately and purposefully we select individuals from all parts of the country in such a manner that we should have at least one individual, say from each city. We might say at least one individual from each institution. We might also say that well, because this is a research about the rights of Christian minority in Pakistan, we might focus just on the undergrad and grad students in 5 major universities of the country. Now, generally speaking, the students in major universities, the national universities in the country, they bring students from all over the country, right? Therefore, the population, the Christian population in most of the national institutions of the country will be a representative population of Christian minority. Therefore, if we share a questionnaire with them and record their responses about the violation of their rights in Pakistan, their responses will provide true representation. Okay, so what we are doing through this kind of survey research is we are collecting responses from the sample population, right? It's from the sample population. We cannot reach out to thousands of people, but we can definitely reach out to 15, 20, 30, or 40 people, 40 individuals who represent the population from across the country. So this is called sampling frame, right? So we use this particular frame to limit the number of responses that we can receive and to limit the number of individuals with whom we can interact. Okay, now the the comparison that we are making right now is between survey research method and oral history as a research method. So survey research method, I mean, its drawback is obvious. We can recognize right from the beginning that this kind of research definitely depends on sample frame and provides just a very broad estimate of what happens to the minorities when it comes to violation of their rights. Okay, because for example, if you are going to focus just on the population in the national institutes of the country, right? So most probably the students who or the individuals who reach the university and who kind of are able to attend a university at undergrad and grad level, they come from the protected families. They come from those, sections of the society which already enjoy a privileged position in their respective communities. They are well protected, they are well respected. Okay, they are already educated, and therefore they are able to enter into big universities of the country. So the sampling that you collect, and the representative responses that you get are actually not true representation of those sections of minority which are kept out of schools, which do not get chance for reasonable education, who do not have good income, you know, the true ordinary people, right? They remain outside this kind of survey-based research. In most of the cases, those people are not even able to, they are not even able to read a survey questionnaire, and they are not able to write their responses to survey questions because they do not understand what those questions mean, right? So the survey research method, which is already available in social sciences, and which was already available in 1960s in sociology, for example, or in other disciplines, had its own limitation, and I just pointed out one of those limitations. Therefore, we needed to turn to a research method which can actually reach out to those people who are not educated or who do not get a chance to become representative, or who are too afraid to speak, or who do not enter into the mainstream life in a particular given society. Now, oral history has that potential because in the case of oral history, the researcher does not provide any survey questions to the participant. And the participant is not able to read any questions as such. And the participant is not required to write responses to any given questions. Right? So there is little more freedom that oral historian has when it comes to collect responses of the participants. However, there are some challenges which are written over here. Those are challenges of specificity, survival, and consent, which an oral historian has to confront. By specificity, we mean that when an oral historian approaches a participant for a narrative, for a narrative or for a story about what happened to her or him, it is very difficult to restrict those participants to a specific point. Because if you try to do that, if you try to make an individual speak to a specific point, that will make that individual conscious of what they are saying. They would feel they were being investigated, that they were being subjected to a study, and that will kind of scare those individuals away, and they might not be able to expose much about their self. The other challenge that oral historian face is that in many cases the subjects or the participants of of oral history, they do not survive to tell their stories. For example, if if somebody wants to work on, let's take the same example of the minority, right, and violation of their rights. We are aware of some of the very tragic events which have taken place across the country, um, against the Christian minority, well, against other minorities as well, right? And we know that some of the minorities in Pakistan, they have been, I mean, just not Christianity, but some of the other minorities in Pakistan as well, they have been subjected to very, very, uh, unfair, unfair situations. Okay, they have even been deprived of their right to life. Right now, in those cases, if a researcher would like to study how the right to life, you know, is not given to the members of that particular minority, the challenge for the researcher would be, in fact, to first of all meet the people who survived, right? So the targets of a kind of um, a targets of a campaign which tries to simply you know uh, deprive those groups of their lives, right? Target of such campaign, the targets of such campaign do not survive to tell their story, right? So if an individual does not survive, or a group of individuals do not survive, how can you listen to their stories, right? So that is the second challenge that oral historian faces. Part of that, that challenge is that if you undertake your oral history research, say 50 years after an event take place, okay? So for example, the Second World War example that we are looking at, about the women guard, right? So if they constituted a group in 1943 or in 1940s, and you are going to conduct your research in 2000, right? So after like 50 to 60 years, you will hardly find any individual who is still surviving. Okay, it's just a matter of time, right? So this is another aspect of the challenge of survival. And the third challenge that historians, oral historians, right, oral historians face is the challenge of consent, right? Uh, so basically, you might listen to the stories which many participants would be able to tell about what they experienced in form of oppression, or in form of you know cruelty, or in form of any misconduct. Uh, so they might be able to tell you their story, but they might not give you consent to share their stories, right? So to begin with, it is very hard to seek the consent even for disclosing the story. That is the primary thing. They might not be willing to narrate what happened to them. But even if they are willing to narrate that, they might not give you consent to share it further. So this is another challenge that oral historians face, right? So survey research method has its own limitations. We just understood that, and that is why we need the oral history method. But oral history method has its own limitations that I just pointed out, or its own challenges that I have just pointed out. However, despite these challenges, this is the main point in oral history method. And the point is this, that reminiscence can produce material that is more valuable for historical recovery than answer to structured questionnaires. So does anybody know what does the word reminiscence mean? What does the word reminiscence mean? Can you look up and tell me
Sir, to
what is
remember.
reminiscence? Okay, very good. So reminiscence is remembering, right? It is remembering the past. All right. So the oral history method works in such a manner where you engage in a conversation with a particular subject whom you identify to be uh, an individual who experienced certain circumstances, and you are interested in that particular individual because you are interested in those kind of experiences that that individual has. For example, if you want to study the women league, the women guard league of UK, in UK, I mean that is just an example. If you want to study about the group itself, you might prepare a questionnaire and give that to the individuals, the women who participated in that particular league in 1940s. And they might be able to give you some responses to the structured questions. But the other way is you come in touch with any of the survivors of that particular women guard. You meet them, you talk to them. And while talking to them, you ask them, what were your experiences? Now, when you put this kind of question to a survivor of that particular group, the survivor will be telling you a story out of her memory. And memory, as a kind of source of information, is much more rooted in the real circumstances that that individual lived in. Also, the memory is rich with information because memory is multidimensional, it is multidirectional. It does not have uh, just one track to pursue. So if you give structured questions to the same individual, the memory of the uh, participant or the memory of the subject will be you know structured according to the questions asked. But if you give an open question to the subject will be able to play out her memory more freely. And when she does that, then she produces a lot of information which even the oral historian might not be expecting to begin with. Therefore, memory becomes a very strong base for the production of a lost history or for the recovery of the lost history. And the oral historian, not only through the memory gathers the facts. Of course, facts are important. But when it comes to oral history, along with the facts, the emotions are very important. Okay, we call them A facts, starting with an A. So when a person speaks out of memory, the person also engages with common human emotions. So, for example, if it is a woman from that women league, what kind of fears they had, what kind of motivation they had to start this group, how did they overcome the gender obstacle, how did they even take courage to do something which only men could do at that time. These are all emotional questions, right? And then it's a question of courage as well, right? How did they muster up so much courage to use weapon at the time when it was not common among women to do so. So when a subject speaks from her own memory, she actually engages with her emotions as well. And when an oral historian listens to this kind of story, which is being told out of memory, the oral historian pays very special attention to the emotional engagement of the subject. Why? Because the emotional engagement of the subject in most of the cases authenticates the content of the narrative. Right? Now, that is why memory or reminiscence is considered to be the primary source of oral historical method. All right. So